think about how the United States became the police of the world? In this lesson, we'll learn about how American imperialism and a war with Spain increased United States power and prestige in the world. Let's learn about the Spanish-American War. As you remember from our last module, through the late 1800s, industrialization was growing, and by the end of the 19th century, many Americans believed that the United States needed to expand its economic markets in order to create even greater economic growth here in America. Many business leaders and politicians agreed that the United States expansion was important because it would create new markets and help to grow our economy. Additionally, it would allow our nation to expand its spheres of influence. In other words, this would allow the United States to have more influence and clout with other nations around the world. A perfect opportunity for the United States to expand its influence over other nations came about in 1898 with one of our close neighbors, the island of Cuba. Cuba was still under the control of Spain. Unfortunately for the Cuban people, the Spanish government was not treating the Cubans well at all. As a matter of fact, many Cubans were dying at the hands of Spanish troops who were stationed in Cuba. Americans soon began to learn of these atrocities by way of the media. Two competing newspaper owners, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, started printing stories about the abuses of the Cuban people by the Spanish. These stories were often exaggerated and untrue. To be honest, many of these stories were printed just to sell newspapers and get people all worked up. This brand of journalism was known as yellow journalism. Because of yellow journalism, American citizens began to call for a tougher foreign policy against the Spanish, an intervention in order to help our neighbors to the south, the Cubans. This war-making stance, also known as jingoism, began to spread throughout the United States. Even the Assistant Secretary of the Navy became involved in this debate over intervention in Cuba. Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt called for war with Spain and, by the time the war actually started, resigned his position and took command of a group of volunteer cavalry known as the Rough Riders. As America moved closer to war with Spain, our government sent a U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, to sit in Havana Harbor in Cuba. On February 15th of 1898, the battleship exploded, killing 270 people aboard. U.S. newspapers began to immediately blame Spain. Yellow journalism worked. Although it was later determined that this explosion was probably an accident, war was declared on Spain in April of 1898. The Spanish-American War was officially declared, and in adopting the Teller Amendment, Congress was careful to stress the government's humanitarian interests in Cuba. Senator Henry Teller stated that the reason for intervention was for liberty and freedom and not for annexation of Cuba. After this declaration of war, U.S. Commodore George Dewey set sail for the Spanish colony of the Philippines. Dewey and his men destroyed the Spanish fleet there and seized control of the Philippine Islands. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Teddy Roosevelt led the Rough Riders in the charge up San Juan Hill. This helped the United States achieve military victory over the Spanish. In less than 3 months, the U.S. had defeated Spain. Many Americans thought it was a quick and easy victory. Future Secretary of State John Hay even called this short military conflict the Splendid Little War. The Spanish-American War officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1898. If you remember, the Teller Amendment, passed at the start of the war, the United States promised independence for Cuba at the end of the war. But the United States still wanted to maintain its sphere of influence over the island. The Cubans began to draft their own constitution in 1900. United States officials insisted that the new constitution include a document called the Platt Amendment. This Platt Amendment basically allowed the U.S. to maintain 2 naval bases in Cuba and allowed for U.S. intervention in Cuba whenever we felt it necessary. Also, as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. However, the end of the war brought great controversy associated with the Philippines. Many government officials had favored the annexation of these islands. However, some Americans could not understand the purpose of our business in the Philippines, thousands of miles away from our mainland. Some Americans even joined the Anti-Imperialist League, an organization founded by Andrew Carnegie that opposed U.S. expansion such as this. The Filipinos waged a resistance movement against any United States occupation. The fighting lasted more than 2 years. By 1902, the United States had loosed its hold on the Philippines, and in 1946, the Philippines officially became a totally independent nation. The Spanish-American War is over, but American imperialism grew, and we will learn more about this as we continue our study of growing U.S. involvement in world affairs.